As chairman of the Internal Market Committee, I'm going to move my chairing to a different arena today. And in fact, the latest chair for one of my participants has arrived just in time. You've got a very comprehensive program, which also has full biographies of all the speakers. I'm embarrassed to find that I have the longest biography of anybody, so I must send you a shorter one next time, since I'm merely chairing the event, but this part of the event. But what I'm going to do is to just invite the speakers for this session, as Pilar said, on interoperability, and particularly with a focus about data portability. And I'm very pleased that we're going to have a consumer input on that as well, since my committee is also responsible for consumer protection issues. So I'm hoping that we're going to have a very wide-ranging set of ideas and discussion. So first of all, I'm going to invite Mark Skilton to come and join me. He's going to come up on here. Give him a round of applause as well, just to get the afternoon going. He's Global Director Strategy from Capgemini. I'm going to sit there, actually. That's it. There we are. We just have to get the order right. I need to be able to see the clock, you see, to time them. He's from Capgemini Infrastructure Services and co-chair of the Cloud Computing Work Group of the Open Group, and I'm sure he'll tell us a bit more about that later. Then next, Steve McGibbon from Microsoft. Again, give him a round of applause also, who's their Chief Technology Officer for Europe, Middle East and Africa. Then Peter Dickman, who's Engineering Manager for Google. Then Guillermo Beltrà, who is the legal officer from BEUC, which, as many of you know, is the European Consumer Representative Organization. And then to conclude, Abdellatif Benjelloun, who is the standards manager from Huawei. Great. So I'm going to hand over the podium to my four first guests for 8 minutes with some slides. Then Abdellatif, I'm sorry, I will get better as the evening goes on, will have a short session to open the discussion. So Mark, I'm going to give you the floor for 8 minutes.
Just not sure about the slides, so if we could go to the first slide. As the introduction says, I've been heavily involved in mainly open standards within the Open Group. It's one of the international standards bodies. And I guess I've got the slot that's really, I'm hoping to try and explain the context of why interoperability and why cloud computing is really important from hopefully a fairly clear definition from a business point of view. So if we move on to the next slide. The issue with cloud computing is that although a lot of these concepts aren't new, if you've been around with mainframe computing, that's something that we've seen the central mainframe back a few decades ago of sharing services is not a new idea. But with the network, with the internet, the open market, the digitization of products and services, what we're finding is this issue that we now have not only just service-orientated architecture, but a business model on top of that. Now the problem with this, and I've been many places with cloud computing, and we've got distinguished members on the panel here from those large companies in cloud computing. What's the significant one big factor really is the ability for providers and consumers to actually come together in a virtual space that doesn't need borders, doesn't need physical time, doesn't need physical space to actually interact. And I think this is something that I find even today, this has been around for a good 10 years or so with social networks, with mobility, with words like big data that you hear all these buzzwords. I think the one thing that really sinks home for me is this idea that it doesn't have to be physically where you are anymore in terms of information technology solutions. So this is what interoperability is. Interoperability, if you look at the IEEE definition, or if you look at W3C or ISO definitions, what they're talking about in interoperability in plain English, hopefully, is that any part of a system, either the browser or the computing or a service provider, can actually work together as if it was just one complete whole. Now that sounds great, but if, like people in this room, we all speak different languages and stuff, and we all meant to work together around a common operation, there may be some difficulties in doing that in reality. The other word you'll hear is data portability. What does data portability mean? It means that your personal data or your transactions, the history, the digital footprint, or I've heard of it sometimes, the smoke trail that you leave behind on the internet, you can actually take that with you and move it to another provider. So that's what data portability means. Interoperability, to repeat again, is the ability for different systems, different parts of a system, which could be in different countries or different companies, or even within individuals on different devices, to work simultaneously together as if it was seamless as one system. So what's the issue behind this? And I think really it's a bit difficult to see from the back there with the slides that we've got here. But really the key issue here is that from a consumer, that's you and me, and also from a country level or from a business level, is that we're talking about significant step change in time, cost, and performance. I mean, like some of us, we may have been to business school and seen all this sort of faster, better, cheaper story that we've all been brought up on. You can be faster or cheaper or better or quicker. With cloud computing, it's a disruptive conflux of different technologies coming together that makes you faster, better, and cheaper all at the same time. What we're finding here is it actually means that we can look at it not just from a device or from a market point of view, but what you can do is you can look at the whole market shifting from weeks or even months of trading down to individual time within a day or within minutes of actually changing the way you procure or provide services online. A step change in time. The second one is services and the social contract. All of us have different digital personas. This is, again, a very sort of 21st century word, I think, in terms of what is the persona. I can have my physical persona. I've got my different persona in terms of what sort of markets and what sort of colleagues I'm working with. And you can put this online, and it follows you around, or in some cases goes to places that you don't want it to go to. But that's another issue. Likewise, with resources, we hear this word called the Internet of Things, the Internet of Everything, IoT. What does that mean? I'm speaking personally in China later in this year, and what's the big buzz over there at the moment, among other things, is ubiquitous computing. What does ubiquitous computing mean? It means that any physical device, anything you're sitting on, this room, this hotel, this presentation even, can actually have some kind of digital footprint, and you can interact with it as if it was a physical thing. And that's what really is down on the right side. Actually, the game is moving on. We've already got what we call in our language utility services in the cloud. Well, now we're on to what I would say wave 2, which is big data, the edge of information on the cloud about you and your company. We're talking about the Internet of Things. It's not just about a browser or a tablet, but actually it's the movement of even your car. If you look at some of these modern cars, they're going to be connected to the internet. Or your TV, you've got the Google TV coming out this year, I believe, and things like that. So this is very much a pervasive trend in the market. So what does this actually mean? Why are we here today in terms of interoperability? If we go to the next slide. Sorry. Just go back one slide. We can go back one slide. It's just that one. What you have to really get your head round, I think, in the terms of what I was trying to show in this slide is this idea that physically, just because it's on a device or in a site somewhere on a computer, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to physically reside there. It doesn't have to be in this country. It doesn't have to be with you in person. And what you can do is, this is the power of this, is this thing that we hear about called long tail. What is long tail? Long tail, this is ability to pick lots of different solutions and services. If you search the internet, or you go into some cloud provider, an app store, or any sort of word like that, you have the choice, you have the ability. The power of this is the choice of what you can do with that click, with that resource, what you get online. There are consequences. There are consequences in terms of being able to move from one border to another in terms of countries. There are consequences of choosing services. They could be human services, they could be content like music, or your bank account, or anything that you can think of now. You can virtually get it digitally online. There can be consequences about data. I spoke about data portability, but it's not just data portability, as you can see from this diagram. You can actually port services, you can port your business, you can port a marketplace. So it's very, very expansive. It's not something that we were taught 20 years ago in business school or anything like that. It's very much a game-changing idea that you have to get your head round. What you have down here in the consumers, I've taken some of the words, I think, from a 2005 or 2008 European Union report. We talk about multilingualism. We talk about multilateralism. We talk about, what's the other big word? Subsidiarity. The ability to do things in a multiple way in the ideal world, for us to talk different languages but share the same resources, for us to be able to do what we do locally best, but share this out to the common whole. This is what really is what interoperability to me is about. But a lot of those things is really complicated from a technology point of view. That I ideally want to be multilingual. I want to be I want to use subsidiarity to leverage the power of the local country to the common good. Or I want to be able to do multilateralism, which is having some consistent sharing of services. But to do that from a computing point of view, on my last slide, is that, just get to the last slide. Not the black one, this one. There are really 4 things to summarize that I think we need to think about from a business and technology point of view. The first one is access control. It constantly amazes me just how quickly you can get access to different services online, either from your mobile cell device or from your iPad or whatever. But what you can do is you can either make that as an empowering thing, or that you can establish some kind of open data service for a government. You can share services, and the way that access control, either controlled by the device or controlled by the solution, will have a big impact on how many people can actually use that service. So I guess we're going to debate that in this session here today. Access control. Who controls access? Is it the vendor? Is it the standard that you're using? Or is it you as an individual or as a country? What is access control? Legal policy, I think if I got a dime or a euro for every time someone mentioned security with cloud, I wouldn't be here. I'd probably be in Barbados or something. And the issue about security is really probably twofold. One is security can actually be an empowering thing. You can actually protect your intellectual property. You can build some kind of advantage around the services and reach a broader market with more standards being open to you and using the leverage of the market through the internet. But security can also be a threat. It can be about content, your personal privacy, your data that's online, or either deliberately or otherwise, which is being exposed and used either for nefarious means or presenting information that you don't want to actually show on a public viewpoint. So the issue around legal issues, particularly from a contractual legality point of view, is what is the terms and conditions that if I have my data with a cloud provider, public or private, where am I legally in terms of the terms and conditions? Who is responsible to look after the security of my data privacy? Yeah. Then finally, the last 2 points is really open provisioning and open standards. In the ideal world, we would be able to present an open storefront, we'd be able to provision any service or any resource anywhere in the world and bring it to your door. And technically, we can do that today through this kind of combination of technologies. And the issue here really is, what type of vertical standards do we need to build into the industry? What type of semantics, that if I call something an apple and you call it also an apple, are we actually talking the same apples, as it were, to use the vernacular? And I think this is really some of the things I'm just throwing at you here, but just break it down into what is it we mean by interoperability, what is it you're actually asking to share, and what do we mean by data standards in particular? So that's me. I think it was about 8 minutes, I hope.
It was nowhere near. But it was very good nonetheless.
Thank you.
No, well, thank you. Well, I was a bit indulgent on timing, partly because I didn't want to tap you on the shoulder. But it was actually 11 minutes, in fact. But it was, nevertheless, it was very interesting. But I think that some of the security issues we'll pick up later. So I just want to double check that, can you all see the slides? I'm conscious of the fact that I've got my panel sitting in front of them, but can you all see? Nobody's objecting. What? Oh, you've got the right. So that's fine. Everybody's happy then. Good. Okay. Right. I'm going now to get Steve McGibbon to come up then to the podium. And hopefully somebody is starting the clock for me. And the clock is down there. And you're going to get a red light at 7 minutes as well. So just keep an eye on it.
Lucky me.
There you are.
A red light at 7, I'm off. 4, 5. Okay, I'll try and be brief with my opening comments. Cloud computing. I think the last point about Apple's is actually not a bad place for me to start. It's increasingly clear to me that we're not all talking about the same thing when we're talking about cloud computing. Sometimes it's used as an alternative for internet computing or the evolution of the web. And so to try and help with that, I'm going to start by explaining what I think cloud computing actually is, and then try and draw some messages from it. And I think I could subtitle my talk, Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, because the first part of it is, what's changed. Cloud computing, from Microsoft's point of view, was a response to scale. Okay, so at some point in the late 90s, a group of companies started to service their customer base and treat their customers as their customers, anybody that had an internet connection. And so the number of people that were making demands on services, think of Hotmail, for example, or eBay, the number of people that were making demands on these services was significantly beyond anything that had ever been seen in enterprise IT before. It was massive. And it was growing incredibly quickly. And so traditional engineering responses to cope with that amount of scale didn't work. And so engineering companies started to develop a set of engineering methods to be able to respond to this unprecedented scale and reach. And so they were things like, fundamentally, they came down to modeling and automation. So you took humans out of the process and automated as much as you possibly could. So for example, if a machine was to be, if a new user was going to be added, they would add themselves. So they would go in, there was no IT in the middle, right? They would fill in a form, and then the form would create the user on the necessary systems, send an email, or give some authentication, some kind of out-of-band signal back, and then allow them to start to use the service. And it was all done automatically. And so the scale, the data centers themselves started to change. So in the past, data centers were much smaller. In some cases, data centers in some companies are actually rooms, right? And now we've got mega data centers. Microsoft has built a massive facility in Dublin and Ireland, 600 million euros investment, probably one of the largest and most environmentally friendly data centers in the world, to cope with massive scale. So if you think about that scale and the investments that you make in order to deliver it, you actually want as many people to come and use those services as you possibly can have. Because to the extent that you can attract everybody that might be a potential user, right, you can drive your cost of infrastructure down and deliver a more competitive offer. And so interoperability is absolutely a fundamental part of the core value proposition that cloud operators consider when they think about how to attract customers. So from Microsoft's point of view, for example, you may have heard, we'll soon announce that you'll be able to have a Linux machine running inside our data center on Azure. If you think that would have been unprecedented just probably 5 years ago. Absolutely unprecedented. We deliver software as a service to iPad devices, to Apple devices. We'll deliver it to Safari web browsers. We'll deliver it to, and these are all done through an engineering approach which Microsoft calls interoperability by design. And I think that this world is very, very different from the enterprise world that perhaps people are considering when they express concerns about interoperability as they relate to cloud computing. Another example, if you think about software as a service, so this is where you actually subscribe to a complete service, right, rather than run it on premises. So that's one kind of cloud computing. Microsoft has an offering called CRM Online, Customer Relationship Management Online. Now, part of Microsoft's approach to this particular service is that if a customer wants to move on premises, so they want to move off the cloud and take that to another hoster or somebody else, they can do that very simply. There's one simple operation. They get 2 files. They take those 2 files. They give them to their next operator or to their own IT department. Those 2 files can then be actioned with all of their data, all of that, and they can immediately, to your point, be up and running very, very quickly. Now that's based on, obviously, interoperability, but it's also built into the business process and the business model. You don't just need to be able to have customers leave. Cloud companies need to attract and be able to bring customers on board very, very quickly and very, very easily. Can you imagine, for example, big data without interoperability? The very term connotes interoperability, the idea that there are massive data sets beyond, in some cases, a single organization's ability to collect or to manage them. And so you require interoperability in order to be able to manipulate those data, get results from them, and then present those results to the users. And the results can be on any device. It's almost, it's almost device agnostic. Okay, the intention is to deliver that. So interoperability there, again, it's built into the core thinking around what the nature of cloud computing is. So I said plus ça change. That's what's changed. What's the same? Again, the point about what is an invoice? If you've got your own definition, your own semantic definition of what an invoice is, that doesn't mean that that's going to match somebody else's semantic definition of what an invoice is. If you want to offer services to customers in 27 countries, you still have to pay attention to 27 different data protection regimes. Right? If you want to offer digital services in Europe, you still have to think about rights management in 27 different countries. And so I think that some of the interoperability issues that cloud computing will really expose come very much into the policy and the semantic domains. And quite frankly, I worry that we'll spend too much time once again focusing on the bits and the bytes and the technology aspects of it, right? Almost as a diversion from focusing on some of the very, very real problems that are higher in the stack and that the technologists absolutely cannot solve alone or without your help. So I'll stop there and give you 40 seconds back.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for a very clear exposition about the importance of interoperability and making apples and everything connect. I think whenever we'll come to that a bit later on. But we're now on to Google now, so I'm going to give Peter the floor.
So for any organization, whether you're a cloud provider or pretty much anything else, if you're going to hold user data, let's see if I can make this actually work. Can I get my slides up? No, well, do them by hand. Could I have my first slide, please? The most important thing when you've got people putting their data into your system, whether it's a cloud or anything else, is the stewardship of that data. It's essential that the owning user has control of it, that they can get their data back whenever they want. They can take it to another service provider if they wish to do so. Now, that's a very simple message, and you can articulate it in lots of different ways, whether it's in your terms of service or, as we're going to see in a moment, from our data liberation front. It's always about what is the service you're providing to the user, to the citizen? What are you doing on their behalf with their data? And this is completely consistent with the proposed right to data portability in the new draft directive. And it's easy for companies to do this right. Within Google, we have a group called the Data Liberation Front. If you've never heard of them, look them up on YouTube. Don't Google them. That leads you to a fairly boring website. Search for them on YouTube, which is the second best search engine in the world. These are a group of engineers based in Chicago whose mission is to make it trivially easy for users to remove their data from Google's systems in a format that makes it easy to get it into somebody else's systems, whoever else they want to use. And they basically have a data liberation philosophy, which underpins the way we think about users their data, and it's part of the proposition for Google, and it can be part of the proposition for any company that hosts user data. And the basic idea is make it easy for people to leave your systems, and then you have to work that little bit harder so they don't want to. You have to provide the service they need. You've not locked them in. And if you get this right, it makes the whole world work that little bit better, but it's completely dependent on the data and the formats, and making sure that everything is open and interoperable, and then you get the data portability for free. That's a solved problem. It still requires engineering work, but we know how to do it. What gets more interesting is when we move on to more complex forms of portability, things like application portability. Because it's all very well saying you shouldn't trap the user's data, but you also shouldn't trap them because you're the only possible provider of a particular type of functionality. Now, just as we rely on open formats to make it possible to move data between systems, so we can use open APIs to allow application portability. So you can build an application on top of a set of known APIs provided by some infrastructure. The engineers can build libraries that will allow a system, an application, to be moved from one set of APIs to another by adding a layer that joins the pieces together. And that gives us something more powerful than just data portability. Now, you could say, oh, well, you wouldn't even need those joining layers if you mandated what the APIs should be, just standardize it right now. Now, that's a mistake. It's a mistake because we don't know how to do everything right yet. Doing that would stifle innovation, and in particular, it would make it much harder for a new startup that had a really brilliant idea to get going. But it can be done with open APIs that you publish. This is a slightly out-of-date chart of Google's APIs. As you'll see, there's lots of them. It's been laid out to look like a periodic table just for a bit of fun. You can't standardize all of those, but one box on that will be the Translate API or the Maps API or the access to the search engine. There's a whole variety of different tools and technologies, ways of getting to either the public data or building tools that allow users to get to their private content, depending on what the application built on those APIs actually is. So the first step is to have these open APIs. That allows you to port things. The hardest problem is going to be when we move to the multi-cloud applications, to get it completely seamless so that your application runs across Azure and Google App Engine and Amazon services, and everything just moves depending on which services are cheapest, which are most available at the moment, whatever it might be. That's still a research problem. It's probably solvable. At the moment, any attempt to solve it turns out to be rather inflexible and expensive. Doesn't give you all of the elasticity that the clouds can provide when you use them in a really nice way. But we'll get there eventually. So that live interoperability is still to come. Right, so I've talked about how we do this, and it's very much about standards and specifications, but we have to be very careful about the difference. The engineers need open specifications so that they know how to join the pieces together. They need to have clear, precise, well-defined specifications for the joined pieces. Turning those specifications into standards where you then expect everyone to use that particular way of doing it only makes sense once we understand what's the right specification. We're not there yet in the cloud world. We'll get there slowly. You need to have the specifications stabilized and demonstrating utility. But there's a nice example of us moving in that direction. That's to do with information security. So thinking about how security of data in the cloud should work. We have an international standard already for information security, which is ISO 27001. That's the gold standard, but there's a problem with it. It wasn't written with clouds in mind. It doesn't quite work for clouds. You can use it, it's perfectly possible to use it, but it's not quite tailored properly. And work is ongoing to fix that, so we will eventually have 27017, which is about 2 years away from publication. And that's going to be an ISO standard which takes the controls from ISO 27002, which is the fine detail, and tweaks them slightly and shows how they should work in clouds, and particularly in global cloud settings. And meanwhile, we have a variety of stopgap measures and other ways of doing it, using accounting standards like ESI 3402, using industry standards like the CSA, CCM techniques, using things like national standards, so FISMA in the USA, which is very closely based on 27001. There's stopgaps until we can get to the real standard once we understand what we're doing. But that's where we're going. We're moving from a world where we can move data around easily now, so we don't have to lock the users in anymore. hope some of us never did, but no excuse for anyone doing that now, to a world where the applications can be more easily ported, and eventually to a world where the boundaries start to disappear. This, however, has some risks. There's a terrible risk of messing up what we're trying to achieve. This is a classic cartoon about standards in general, where if you have lots of things that have been prematurely standardized, you think, oh, we must be able to do better. Let's just try and come up with the new standard that will make all of the others redundant. And unfortunately, you almost never do actually make the preceding ones redundant. You just add yet another standard. So you have to be careful not to fall into that trap. But to sort of bring this all to a little bit of a close before I run out of time, if this button will do what I need. No. All right, I've lost my last slide. Maybe it will come back. The key to interoperability, the key to data portability is making sure that we've got openness, clarity in the specifications so that the engineers can do their work. That's what's going to give us an open market. That's going to be what enables the healthy competition. It will give us the efficient technologies that will allow effective use across national boundaries, across organizational boundaries where this is appropriate, so that we can actually get the economic benefits that are going to basically dig us out of the hole we're all in at the moment. And doing things like making openness a right, as the draft directive hopes to do, is a great idea for enshrining those constructive goals into law without making the mistake of prematurely specifying technology. Specifying a particular way of doing things, a particular mechanism, can be risky because you can fix the world before we know how to actually do it right. If we do this properly, get the cloud benefits at a global scale, because, as has just been said, the biggest, most efficient clouds have a lot of users, then we're going to need some global leadership. It's not enough to have leadership within one company or within one nation state. This is where the EU comes in and becomes so important, because it's already showing how you can work across supranational levels. We need to go beyond just the European level, but at least the EU has a sense of how to work across multiple legal systems, try and tie us together so we can end up with a global solution to this. So it's all possible. We just have to do it right, and hopefully things like the cloud partnership will get us there. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed. And then finally, from our 8-minute interventions, Mr. Beltrà from BEUC.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank the European Internet Foundation, Mr. Castillo and Mr. Harbour, for inviting us today to this very interesting event. For those of you who don't know BEUC, it's a European consumer organization. We represent 42 very well-reputed national consumer organizations at a European level. We aggregate their interest and we defend them here in Brussels. And it will not come to a surprise to you that cloud computing is a top hit with consumers. The best proof is the increasing numbers of consumers that are using new cloud services of all sorts, be it social networking sites, storing sites, music sites, and so on. But why is it beneficial for them? It's beneficial because it's convenient, because they have a ubiquitous access to all their data. They can achieve larger storing capacity that they could achieve maybe locally. It reduces many of the expenditures that they have to confront when they use all their IT infrastructure in their own households. There's a great potential for innovation because there are minimum entry costs and infrastructure requirements. And there is a good potential for an increase in reliability and in security. Now, but like in all markets, consumers need choice. And this is very important in the market for cloud computing, we believe. Choice needs competition. And for us, competition requires switching. Consumers need to be able to easily switch between providers. And what does this mean? Well, first of all, like it has been mentioned by some speakers before, there should not be any locking situations, either by contractual restrictions or by technical restrictions. So this should be avoided. And we completely welcome when companies like Google was mentioned before envisage that in their sort of gene workings. And switching cost must be limited. Sorry. Now, switching, especially in cloud computing, needs data portability. For us, it's a condition sine qua non. It makes no sense for a consumer to stock massive tons of data on one service, and if they want to switch to another because they're unhappy with the service they're paying for, they cannot go with their data. Now, it is being envisaged as a right for consumers, but I would like to put the question to everybody here and to the panel, should it not be an obligation for providers? It is so important for consumers to be able to grab their data and either download it to their own computers and then decide where to go to, or to actually request that the data be moved to a new provider, that maybe it should be an obligation for providers to foresee in all their systems that data should be portable with other competing platforms, whatever they are. Now, we strongly believe that consumers need their ownership of their data, and portability is a condition for this. As it has also been mentioned before, for consumers to own their data, they need to be able to download a copy of their data at any time, easily and with no restrictions, hopefully with no costs either. And that needs to be compatible with the right to erasure. So if consumers are downloading a copy of their data because they're finalizing a contract with a provider, it has to be ensured that that data no longer remains there for the provider. And that raises questions of what happens with third parties and so on. So we would like to, more than interoperability, because I know that's a very technical discussion and we don't want to go that far, but more the fact of portability is we would like to encourage that cloud services need to be compatible. Across the board, where applicable, of course. We have received a lot of comments that there are many, we cannot make compatible certain services that offer very different services for consumers. But where applicable, where they're of the same nature, they should be compatible amongst themselves. Now, one thing we're also not talking about often, I think, is the fact that consumers may want to have their data transferred between providers directly. That would bring a lot of benefits. Imagine you have stored on the cloud 150 gigabytes of your holidays pictures. It is very cumbersome for consumers that do not have a lot of technical knowledge to download that to their own computers and then have to re-upload that to a new cloud service provider. So we would encourage companies to find a way to be able to offer automatic transfers of data between the different services. This would facilitate the process in terms of time for consumers and the technical knowledge required. In terms of interoperability, we think that proprietary structures don't help if they are curtailing interoperability. So in that sense, and we agree with what Ms. Del Castillo was saying at the beginning, the maximum degrees of interoperability between services and applications needs to be encouraged. If that means open standards or not is a different question, but in that sense, it should not be curtailed. Finally, some quick comments on the latest proposal by the European Commission for the new regulation. We welcome Article 18, but as I was saying before, should it remain a right or should it be an obligation? The question of third parties is also an important one. If a consumer uploads data to a cloud service provider, what happens when there is additional data that is collected on other grounds, different from what their original purpose was? And what happens with the data that the original providers has shared with other parties? I think it is very important that we look at these issues and that we clarify them and that whatever new initiatives come up offer some security for consumers. And I'll leave it at this now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good. Well, finally, I'm just going to, because we've discussed and heard about the importance of standards and specifications. So I'm going to invite our final speaker from Huawei, Abdellatif, who's going to just say a bit about that. He's the standards manager for Huawei, and I think the first time we've had someone from Huawei on the platform here, so you're particularly welcome. So we're going to give you 2 minutes. We'll start the clock.
Thank you very much. So, in fact, after hearing the voice of both the consumer and its requirement, and also the intervention from the cloud service providers and technology provider, I want just to highlight here an important point from the role that can play telecom service provider in this to ensure this interoperability. In fact, we have two elements here: the consumer and technology service provider and telecom provider can play, and service provider can play key role in between to ensure this interoperability. In fact, this is an ongoing work in standards, and they can about the definition of cloud brokering, and this concept of cloud brokering can ensure this interoperability. Why I am highlighting here the role of telecom service provider is mainly because they can hide this complexity and also make all these heterogeneities of services and system hidden for the end user. And I would like here to highlight the importance of some ongoing work, standardization. I think the speakers has already mentioned the importance of open standards, but just let me highlight some standard bodies that doing some good work, both at the architecture level and at deep technical level, like in ISO SC 38, DMTF, and ITUT, and others that are working more to collect the voice of the user, be it the big companies, the consumer, or also the public sector, and this is ongoing work in TC Cloud. So finally, before finishing, I would like to point out that we would like to reach this nice concept, interoperability, but we should go step by step. This is not an absolute concept on which we will go in one step, and trying to catalyze some segments of the market to shape up and take off is very important. And I think after that, the dynamic of the market can continue in a natural way. So this is why we believe that the European Cloud Partnership is the good tool to play this role, starting from the public sector market segments. Thank you very much.
Good. Well, thank you very much. I think we've had some really interesting debates. I think there's been a lot of agreement, but I think there are clearly a lot of issues for policy, which is what's important. So I'm just looking at Pilar. We started a bit late, so I'm hoping that we'll be indulged with this panel for about 10 minutes for questions. I'm going to give each of the panelists an opportunity at the end just to give us some closing remarks based on what they've heard from their other panelists. But can we just see, first of all, if anybody would like to make any comments from the floor? I think we have a microphone here. We have a lady with a microphone. So who would like to, can I tempt anybody to break the ice? Yes. If you can also introduce yourself, Michael, to everybody.
Oh, thank you, Malcolm. Michael Maybach, the European American Business Council. For anyone who would like to answer the question, perhaps the fellow from BEUC. You said that I have the right as a consumer to own my own data. So if I buy a watch on eBay, perhaps I do own that information, but is my credit history my data, and therefore, or my medical history, or my employment history, or my college records, are those all my data, and therefore can I erase those or control those and not share those with others?
Okay, well I think we'll invite the consumers to, Guillermo can start on that, and then one of our cloud providers maybe may also want to comment.
Is it working? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Well, obviously the considerations I was talking about focus on end user services where we're talking about personal data mostly. Now, your question is more, is that personal data or not? All I'm saying is that wherever there is personal data, and we're talking about data, they need to retain ownership of that data and be able to move it around between services. So, I mean, I don't think it is easy or the right platform right now to go into specific details of the different kinds of platforms you were talking about. But ownership for me is about that.
I have a very simplistic view of this. If I was a student, as I was, then the fact I was a student and knowledge of the fact I have a degree in a certain subject from a certain institution, that's information that no one should be able to take away from me. It's an achievement of mine. But that institution also has data which says I was a student there. And I think we sometimes get confused and we think that data can only have one owner. And I might want to stop telling people that I was a maths student a long time ago, but that university might want to still keep a record of the fact that I was a student there at that time, and it's not clear that I should have the right to make them lie about something that is a fact. I think we get too often bogged down in the idea that a single datum can only have one owner.
Well, I'll just bring this back to, I completely agree, and I think with cloud services, there's a real issue there, because in some cases, cloud operators are required by law to retain logs, and the logs are required by law to be able to identify a user, so an IP address or whatever, and at the same time, an IP address, can be considered PII, and so therefore needs to be protected, and so there are concerns. So in some cases, regulators are, at both ends of the spectrum. On the one hand, saying thou shalt protect private data, and on the other hand saying thou shalt retain it, please, because we might need it.
Okay. I think we're going to cover some of these points in the next session as well, but it's interesting about their preoccupation. Now, who else would like to make a comment from the floor? Anybody else I see there? Perhaps then I could sort of turn to the panel, because one of the things that struck me about the discussion was, and I think I'm trying to remember which one of you said it, but I was making some notes. By the way, I'm making notes here because I have to report back later on, so I'm trying to be very comprehensive about that. But there was the question about the difference between standards and specifications, and all of you at some area made a reference about standards. But there was also the issue about when do you turn an evolving specification into a standard? That was one question. But on the other hand, a number of you said, well, as a cloud service provider, interoperability and portability of data is a fundamental sort of business requirement for a successful cloud service provider. So in other words, you're already doing that. So, I think my broader question is, do we already have sufficient standards in place? And how far are those standards going to keep evolving? In other words, do we want to be fairly selective about moving to standardize something when actually things are going to be evolving all the time? And should there be some more generic provision just to ensure interoperability in the broadest sense, and basically to let the market work? Who'd like to start on that? We'll start with standards. Yeah, we'll pass that now to you. Why don't each of you have a go at that? And then if there are any other questions, then we'll take them.
Well, I think in terms of sufficiency, we have enough standards, ongoing. But having experience with other area of standards of technology that are enough mature, I think cloud computing it's in infancy. So it's normal that we have a lot of standards competing between each another, overlapping. So I think that there will be some natural evolution toward standards that are efficient to solve the problem of the market and give the real solution that people want. So this is one area from which we can see this question.
Well, to be completely honest, standards and specifications is not the core focus of our work, but thinking out loud, I would think that maybe as standards evolve and new services use different specifications or standards, I think a very important thing, and we see this across many sectors, is that consumers need to be informed. So they should be, whenever they subscribe to a service, they need to be informed what the compatibility of that service is, whether in terms of standards or with other competing services, and so on.
Yes, I think openness about what you're offering is an important part of the answer here. If we go back to around the time I was born, which is sort of the dawn of digital computing, we didn't have a common way of representing data at all, and we've moved on to 8-bit bytes and Unicode as a way of representing data, and it's taken us decades to do that. At the moment where we are with data portability, if you look at, say, the document space, we have a small number of different formats that are used. Some of them grew out of proprietary provisions. Some of them started off as more sort of designed to be open, less encumbered approaches. And right now, we're using many of them because it's not entirely clear which is the best, and there may be new ones still to come. And so I think we are still at a stage where we need to assume there will be more things coming and new open specifications. But the market will clean this up over time. There will be things that fall by the wayside, whether it's in how we represent video, how we represent documents, how we represent spreadsheets, and so on. This will change over time. I would say the more the merrier at the moment within reason. It's not that hard to write the converters. If the specifications are written cleanly and carefully, we can handle pretty much anything. And right now will be a bad time because we don't have perfect answers yet.
Is clean and careful data writing capable of being a sort of broader concept? I mean, that's rather interesting that you use that phrase. Is that a code word for open data, or is this? No, are there some certain principles that?
Writing down what you're doing helps. Sometimes people don't write down all the fine detail, and that's a problem. It's not necessarily about open data, but that tends to come naturally if you do this right.
So I think standards have an important role. I think that the only issue that I would flag is that I feel uncomfortable when people start to say people shouldn't have standards. So the slide with we had 14, next situation you had 15. I think that there's an ecosystem of standards and they need to adapt. And I formed my opinion during the standardization of OpenXML and what happened then, which you can maybe obliquely refer to. And that's that I think that any group of users that wants a standard has got a right to be able to create a standard if they want to use that. I think that you then start to get into difficulties when people try to mandate particular standards or prefer others. I think that there is a very, very active ecosystem of cloud standardization. And I think that one of the key things is that if you standardize and prevent competition or water down competition, then you don't actually have choice. What you end up with is people that can only provide the lowest common denominator of service. And so I think at that point, standards can become a negative factor, not in and of themselves, but because of the way that they're applied. So I think what's really, really matters is that people understand that standards have a very important role, but it has to be an appropriate role, and that you do need choice, but you don't just need a choice, kind of a theoretical choice. You need a practical choice. So, for example, I noticed my two colleagues on my left are using iPads, right? For sure, the applications that they're using are absolutely not interoperable with anything, okay? But they've been able to exercise a choice, and as a result, the company that I work for is having to run very hard to compete and to innovate to be able to match and soon overtake.
Certainly in the open group standards work I do, we do often address the question you asked was, when does specification become a standard? And I think what we try to use is we use basically a common agreed view on access and fair competition when there's a majority, and there's a debate of what does majority mean, are in favour of converting it into a standard. And I think diversity is fine, but I think often there's a confusion I see in terms of what we mean by big users. Like, I understand my panel colleagues saying that any group of users can create a standard. It's just that when that group becomes so large that they dictate the standard of all other users in that market. And I think often what I see, particularly with platform vendors, is they confuse ownership with right of access. So if I'm borrowing or using a cloud, it doesn't necessarily mean I've automatically got visibility of what they're doing with that data, that I automatically confer a right to them to go and use the data how they would like to use it themselves, because it may not be in my interest. And I think often In IT speak, it's confusing physical and virtual, me thinking that they're the same thing when they're not. And that what I basically would boil down to is that things need to be visible. My data needs to be visible. That there needs to be some legislation to make my rights visible in the virtual world, because it's easy to see it physically but not virtually. And just the last point I'd like to say, if you look at, say, the UK government with the G-Cloud initiative, they just launched the App Store. I think it's interesting that I believe I'm correct, I think I'm correct in that 50%, the policy is 50% of those application vendors are meant to be small to medium-sized company providers. I think you have to legislate to get some balance in the competition. It just won't happen organically.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, generally, the problem of standards is after that the adoption by the market, and well, we can think about it to be natural, so the bad standards or rubbish standards will not be adopted, but the others will be adopted. But since we are at the beginning of the cloud, I think we have to enforce this loop of having good standards, adoption by the market, new requirements, to have this positive iteration loop. So here I see the governments or the international initiatives between EU and the US or within the EU, like European Cloud Partnership, is very important to try to enforce this loop. Well, I know that there's not a lot of information for the moment about this European Cloud Partnership, but my feeling, my personal feeling as an engineer and someone who has worked in standards before, that can play a very important role in this, to enforce this iteration to work.
Steve, you wanted to just comment on that?
I'd like to make one other point on standards, and that's that I think that ISO and the international standardization system is important and helps to alleviate some of the negative consequences of what you observed. And I think that it's important in Europe in particular that that's given the right level of consideration, and that consortia, which I think can reintroduce this risk of, groups of bodies going off and not having the global perspective, which includes languages and other cultural considerations as well. That needs to be very finely balanced, and I think sometimes I'm a little bit concerned that the debate in Europe is tipping a little bit towards consortia, at the expense of ISO, which may be slower but produces, I think, more long-lasting standards.
Good. Well, I think that's an important political point at which to end, because some of you may know that my committee has just voted on our opinion on the revision of the standards regulation, which does allow, for the first time, for the European Commission to mandate consortia and also to endorse IC consortia standards. But I think, the balance between the two is the legislation is blind about that, because that will be a policy decision. It's merely an enabling provision, but it does recognise the importance of standards consortia, particularly in the ICT world. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you feel that we've started off the debate fully by exploring a lot of the issues. I'm sure we'll come back to some of them later on. So I'd like you to join me in giving my panellists a really big round of applause for their contributions.